Chapter 26 of Lady Audley's Secret. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 26. So Far and No Farther. Robert left Audley the next morning by an early train, and reached Shoreditch a little after 9 o'clock. He did not return to his chambers, but called a cab and drove straight to Crescent Villas, West Brompton. He knew that he should fail in finding the lady he went to seek at this address, as his uncle had failed a few months before, but he thought it possible to obtain some clue to the schoolmistress's new residence, in spite of Sir Michael's ill success.
Mrs. Vincent was in a dying state, according to the telegraphic message, Robert thought. If I do find her, I shall at least succeed in discovering whether that message was genuine.
He found Crescent Villas after some difficulty. The houses were large, but they lay half embedded among the chaos of brick and rising mortar around them. New terraces, new streets, new squares led away into hopeless masses of stone and plaster on every side. The roads were sticky with damp clay, which clogged the wheels of the cab and buried the fetlocks of the horse. The desolations, that awful aspect of incompleteness and discomfort which pervades a new and unfinished neighborhood, had set its dismal seal upon the surrounding streets which had arisen about and entrenched Crescent Villas, and Robert wasted 40 minutes by his watch, and an hour and a quarter by the cabman's reckoning, in driving up and down uninhabited streets and terraces, trying to find the villas, whose chimney tops were frowning down upon him black and venerable, amid groves of virgin plaster, undimmed by time or smoke. But having at last succeeded in reaching his destination, Mr. Audley alighted from the cab, directed the driver to wait for him at a certain corner, and set out upon his voyage of discovery.
If I were a distinguished Q.C., I could not do this sort of thing, he thought. My time would be worth a guinea or so a minute, and I should be retained in the great case of Hoggs versus Boggs, going forward this very day before a special jury at Westminster Hall. As it is, I can afford to be patient.
He inquired for Mrs. Vincent at the number which Mr. Dawson had given him. The maid who opened the door had never heard that lady's name, but after going to inquire of her mistress, she returned to tell Robert that Mrs. Vincent had lived there, but that she had left 2 months before the present occupants had entered the house. "And Mrs. has been here 15 months," the girl added emphatically.
"But you cannot tell where she went on leaving here?" Robert asked despondingly.
"No, sir. Mrs. says she believes the lady failed, and that she left sudden-like, and didn't want her address to be known in the neighborhood." Mr. Audley felt himself at a standstill once more. If Mrs. Vincent had left the place in debt, she had no doubt scrupulously concealed her whereabouts. There was little hope, then, of learning her address from the tradespeople, and yet, on the other hand, it was just possible that some of her sharpest creditors might have made it their business to discover the defaulter's retreat. He looked about him for the nearest shops, and found a baker's, a stationer's, and a fruiterer's a few paces from the Crescent. 3 empty-looking, pretentious shops, with plate-glass windows, and a hopeless air of gentility. He stopped at the baker's, who called himself a pastry cook and confectioner, and exhibited some specimens of petrified sponge cake in glass bottles, and some highly glazed tarts covered with green gauze. "She must have bought bread," Robert thought, as he deliberated before the baker's shop, "and she is likely to have bought it at the handiest place. I'll try the baker." The baker was standing behind his counter, disputing the items of a bill with a shabby genteel young woman. He did not trouble himself to attend to Robert Audley until he had settled the dispute, but he looked up as he was receipting the bill, and asked the barrister what he pleased to want. "Can you tell me the address of a Mrs. Vincent who lived at No. 9 Crescent Villas a year and a half ago?" Mr. Audley inquired mildly. "No, I can't," answered the baker, growing very red in the face, and speaking in an unnecessarily loud voice. "And what's more, I wish I could. That lady owes me upward of £11 for bread, and it's rather more than I can afford to lose. If anybody can tell me where she lives, I shall be much obliged to him for doing so." Robert Audley shrugged his shoulders and wished the man good morning. He felt that his discovery of the lady's whereabouts would involve more troubles than he had expected. He might have looked for Mrs. Vincent's name in the post office directory, but he thought it scarcely likely that a lady who was on such uncomfortable terms with her creditors would afford them so easy a means of ascertaining her residence. "If a baker can't find her, how should I find her?" he thought despairingly. "If a resolute, sanguine, active, and energetic creature such as the baker fail to achieve this business, how can a lymphatic wretch like me hope to accomplish it? Where the baker has been defeated, what preposterous folly it would be for me to try to succeed." Mr. Audley abandoned himself to these gloomy reflections as he walked slowly back toward the corner at which he had left the cab. About halfway between the baker's shop and this corner, he was arrested by hearing a woman's step close at his side, and a woman's voice asking him to stop. He turned and found himself face to face with the shabbily dressed woman whom he had left settling her account with the baker. What?" he asked vaguely. "Can I do anything for you, ma'am? Does Mrs. Vincent owe you money, too?" "Yes, sir," the woman answered, with a semi-genteel manner which corresponded with the shabby gentility of her dress. "Mrs. Vincent is in my debt, but it isn't that, sir. I want to know, please, what your business may be with her, because... "You can give me her address if you choose, ma'am. That's what you mean to say, isn't it?" The woman hesitated a little, looking rather suspiciously at Robert. "You're not connected with the tally business, are you, sir?" she asked, after considering Mr. Audley's personal appearance for a few moments. "The what, ma'am?" asked the young barrister, staring aghast at his questioner. "I'm sure I beg your pardon, sir," exclaimed the little woman, seeing that she had made some awful mistake. "I thought you might have been, you know. Some of the gentlemen who collect for the tally shops do dress so very handsome, and I know Mrs. Vincent owes a good deal of money." Robert Audley laid his hand upon the speaker's arm. "My dear madam," he said, "I want to know nothing of Mrs. Vincent's affairs. So far from being concerned in what you call the tally business, I have not the remotest idea what you mean by that expression. You may mean a political conspiracy. You may mean some new species of taxes. Mrs. Vincent does not owe me any money, however badly she may stand with that awful-looking baker. I never saw her in my life, but I wish to see her today for the simple purpose of asking her a few very plain questions about a young lady who once resided in her house. If you know where Mrs. Vincent lives and will give me her address, you will be doing me a great favor." He took out his card-case and handed a card to the woman, who examined the slip of pasteboard anxiously before she spoke again. "I'm sure you look and speak like a gentleman, sir," she said, after a brief pause, "and I hope you will excuse me if I've seemed mistrustful like, but poor Mrs. Vincent has had dreadful difficulties, and I'm the only person hereabouts that she's trusted with her addresses. I'm a dressmaker, sir, and I've worked for her for upward of 6 years, and though she doesn't pay me regular, you know, sir, she gives me a little money on account now and then, and I get on as well as I can. I may tell you where she lives, then, sir? You haven't deceived me, have you?" "On my honor, no." "Well, then, sir," said the dressmaker, dropping her voice as if she thought the pavement beneath her feet, or the iron railings before the houses by her side, might have ears to hear her. "It's Acacia Cottage, Peckham Grove. I took a dress there yesterday for Mrs. Vincent." "Thank you," said Robert, writing the address in his pocket-book. "I am very much obliged to you, and you may rely upon it, Mrs. Vincent shall not suffer any inconvenience through me." He lifted his hat, bowed to the little dressmaker, and turned back to the cab. "I have beaten the baker, at any rate," he thought. "Now for the second stage, traveling backward in my lady's life." The drive from Brompton to the Peckham Road was a very long one, and between Crescent Villas and Acacia Cottage, Robert Audley had ample leisure for reflection. He thought of his uncle lying weak and ill in the oak room at Audley Court. He thought of the beautiful blue eyes watching Sir Michael's slumbers, the soft white hands tending on his waking moments, the low musical voice soothing his loneliness, cheering and consoling his declining years. What a pleasant picture it might have been, had he been able to look upon it ignorantly, seeing no more than others saw, looking no further than a stranger could look. But with the black cloud which he saw brooding over it, what an arch mockery, what a diabolical delusion it seemed. Peckham Grove, pleasant enough in the summer-time, has rather a dismal aspect upon a dull February day, when the trees are bare and leafless, and the little gardens desolate. Acacia Cottage bore small token of the fitness of its nomenclature, and faced the road with its stuccoed walls sheltered only by a couple of attenuated poplars. But it announced that it was Acacia Cottage by means of a small brass plate upon one of the gate-posts, which was sufficient indication for the sharp-sighted cabman who dropped Mr. Audley upon the pavement before the little gate. Acacia Cottage was much lower in the social scale than Crescent Villas, and the small maidservant who came to the low wooden gate and parleyed with Mr. Audley was evidently well used to the encounter of relentless creditors across the same feeble barricade. She murmured the familiar domestic fiction of the uncertainty regarding her mistress's whereabouts, and told Robert that if he would please to state his name and business, she would go and see if Mrs. Vincent was at home. Mr. Audley produced a card, and wrote in pencil under his own name, "A connection of the late Miss Graham." He directed the small servant to carry his card to her mistress, and quietly awaited the result. The servant returned in about 5 minutes with the key of the gate. Her mistress was at home, she told Robert as she admitted him, and would be happy to see the gentleman. The square parlor into which Robert was ushered bore in every scrap of ornament, in every article of furniture, the unmistakable stamp of that species of poverty which is most comfortless because it is never stationary. The mechanic who furnishes his tiny sitting-room with half a dozen cane chairs, a Pembroke table, a Dutch clock, a tiny looking-glass, a crockery shepherd and shepherdess, and a set of gaudily japanned iron tea-trays, makes the most of his limited possessions, and generally contrives to get some degree of comfort out of them. But the lady who loses the handsome furniture of the house she is compelled to abandon, and encamps in some smaller habitation with the shabby remainder, brought in by some merciful friend at the sale of her effects, carries with her an aspect of genteel desolation and tawdry misery not easily to be paralleled in wretchedness by any other phase which poverty can assume. The room which Robert Audley surveyed was furnished with the shabbier scraps snatched from the ruin which had overtaken the imprudent schoolmistress in Crescent Villas. A cottage piano, a chiffonier, 6 sizes too large for the room, and dismally gorgeous in gilded mouldings that were chipped and broken, a slim-legged card table, placed in the post of honor, formed the principal pieces of furniture. A threadbare patch of Brussels carpet covered the center of the room, and formed an oasis of roses and lilies upon a desert of shabby green drugget. Knitted curtains shaded the windows, in which hung wire baskets of horrible-looking plants of the cactus species, that grew downward, like some demented class of vegetation, whose prickly and spider-like members had a fancy for standing on their heads. The green baize-covered card-table was adorned with gaudily bound annuals or books of beauty, placed at right angles, but Robert Audley did not avail himself of these literary distractions. He seated himself upon one of the rickety chairs, and waited patiently for the advent of the schoolmistress. He could hear the hum of half a dozen voices in a room near him, and the jingling harmonies of a set of variations in "De Conte" upon a piano, whose every wire was evidently in the last stages of attenuation. He had waited for about a quarter of an hour, when the door was opened, and a lady, very much dressed, and with the setting sunlight of faded beauty upon her face, entered the room. "Mr. Audley, I presume," she said, motioning to Robert to reseat himself, and placing herself in an easy-chair opposite to him. "You will pardon me, I hope, for detaining you so long. My duties—"
"It is I who should apologize for intruding upon you," Robert answered politely. "But my motive for calling upon you is a very serious one, and must plead my excuse. You remember the lady whose name I wrote upon my card?"
"Perfectly."
"May I ask how much you know of that lady's history since her departure from your house?"
"Very little. In point of fact, scarcely anything at all. Miss Graham, I believe, obtained a situation in the family of a surgeon resident in Essex. Indeed, it was I who recommended her to that gentleman. I have never heard from her since she left me."
"But you have communicated with her?" Robert asked eagerly.
"No, indeed."
Mr. Audley was silent for a few moments, the shadow of gloomy thoughts gathering darkly on his face. "May I ask if you sent a telegraphic dispatch to Miss Graham early in last September, stating that you were dangerously ill, and that you wished to see her?"
Mrs. Vincent smiled at her visitor's question. "I had no occasion to send such a message," she said. "I have never been seriously ill in my life." Robert Audley paused before he asked any further questions, and scrawled a few penciled words in his notebook.
"If I ask you a few straightforward questions about Miss Lucy Graham, madam," he said. "Will you do me the favor to answer them without asking my motive in making such inquiries?"
"Most certainly," replied Mrs. Vincent. "I know nothing to Miss Graham's disadvantage, and have no justification for making a mystery of the little I do know."
"Then will you tell me at what date the young lady first came to you?"
Mrs. Vincent smiled and shook her head. She had a pretty smile, the frank smile of a woman who had been admired, and who has too long felt the certainty of being able to please, to be utterly subjugated by any worldly misfortune. "It's not the least use to ask me, Mr. Audley," she said. "I'm the most careless creature in the world. I never did and never could remember dates, though I do all in my power to impress upon my girls how important it is for their future welfare that they should know when William the Conqueror began to reign, and all that kind of thing. But I haven't the remotest idea when Miss Graham came to me, although I know it was ages ago, for it was the very summer I had my peach-colored silk. But we must consult Tonks. Tonks is sure to be right." Robert Audley wondered who or what Tonks could be, a diary, perhaps, or a memorandum book, some obscure rival of Letsome. Mrs. Vincent rung the bell, which was answered by the maidservant who had admitted Robert. "Ask Miss Tonks to come to me," she said. "I want to see her particularly." In less than 5 minutes Miss Tonks made her appearance. She was wintry and rather frost-bitten in aspect, and seemed to bring cold air in the scanty folds of her somber merino dress. She was no age in particular, and looked as if she had never been younger, and would never grow older, but would remain forever working backward and forward in her narrow groove, like some self-feeding machine for the instruction of young ladies. "Tonks, my dear," said Mrs. Vincent without ceremony, "this gentleman is a relative of Miss Graham's. Do you remember how long it is since she came to us at Crescent Villas?"
"She came in August, 1854," answered Miss Tonks. "I think it was the 18th of August, but I'm not quite sure that it wasn't the 17th. I know it was on a Tuesday."
"Thank you, Tonks, you are a most invaluable darling," exclaimed Mrs. Vincent with her sweetest smile. It was perhaps because of the invaluable nature of Miss Tonks's services that she had received no remuneration whatever from her employer for the last 3 or 4 years. Mrs. Vincent might have hesitated to pay from very contempt for the pitiful nature of the stipend as compared with the merits of the teacher. "Is there anything else that Tonks or I can tell you, Mr. Audley?" asked the schoolmistress. "Tonks has a far better memory than I have."
"Can you tell me where Miss Graham came from when she entered your household?" Robert inquired.
"Not very precisely," answered Mrs. Vincent. "I have a vague notion that Miss Graham said something about coming from the seaside, but she didn't say where, or if she did I have forgotten it. Tonks, did Miss Graham tell you where she came from?"
"Oh, no," replied Miss Tonks, shaking her grim little head significantly. "Miss Graham told me nothing. She was too clever for that. She knows how to keep her own secrets, in spite of her innocent ways and her curly hair," Miss Tonks added spitefully. "You think she had secrets?" Robert asked rather eagerly.
"I know she had," replied Miss Tonks with frosty decision.
"All manner of secrets. I wouldn't have engaged such a person as junior teacher in a respectable school without so much as one word of recommendation from any living creature." "You had no reference, then, from Miss Graham?" asked Robert, addressing Mrs. Vincent.
"No," the lady answered, with some little embarrassment. "I waived that. Miss Graham waived the question of salary. I could not do less than waive the question of reference. She quarreled with her papa, she told me, and she wanted to find a home away from all the people she had ever known. She wished to keep herself quite separate from these people. She had endured so much, she said, young as she was, and she wanted to escape from her troubles. How could I press her for a reference under these circumstances, especially when I saw that she was a perfect lady? You know that Lucy Graham was a perfect lady, Tonks, and it is very unkind for you to say such cruel things about my taking her without a reference."
"When people make favorites, they are apt to be deceived in them,"
Miss Tonks answered with icy sententiousness, and with no very perceptible relevance to the point in discussion. "I never made her a favorite, you jealous Tonks," Mrs. Vincent answered reproachfully. "I never said she was as useful as you, dear. You know I never did." "Oh, no," replied Miss Tonks, with a chilling accent. "You never said she was useful. She was only ornamental, a person to be shown off to visitors, and to play fantasias on the drawing-room piano." "Then you can give me no clue to Miss Graham's previous history?" Robert asked, looking from the schoolmistress to her teacher. He saw very clearly that Miss Tonks bore an envious grudge against Lucy Graham, a grudge which even the lapse of time had not healed. "If this woman knows anything to my lady's detriment, she will tell it," he thought. "She will tell it only too willingly." But Miss Tonks appeared to know nothing whatever, except that Miss Graham had sometimes declared herself an ill-used creature, deceived by the baseness of mankind, and the victim of unmerited sufferings, in the way of poverty and deprivation. Beyond this Miss Tonks could tell nothing, and although she made the most of what she did know, Robert soon sounded the depth of her small stock of information. "I have only one more question to ask," he said at last. "It is this: did Miss Graham leave any books or knick-knacks, or any other kind of property whatever behind her, when she left your establishment?" "Not to my knowledge," Mrs. Vincent replied. "Yes," cried Miss Tonks, sharply. "She did leave something. She left a box. It's upstairs in my room. I've got an old bonnet in it. Would you like to see the box?" she asked, addressing Robert. "If you will be so good as to allow me," he answered, "I should very much like to see it." "I'll fetch it down," said Miss Tonks. "It's not very big." She ran out of the room before Mr. Audley had time to utter any polite remonstrance. "How pitiless these women are to each other," he thought, while the teacher was absent. "This one knows intuitively that there is some danger to the other lurking beneath my questions. She sniffs the coming trouble to her fellow female creature, and rejoices in it, and would take any pains to help me. What a world it is, and how these women take life out of her hands! Helen Maldon, Lady Audley, Clara Talboys, and now Miss Tonks, all womankind from beginning to end." Miss Tonks re-entered while the young barrister was meditating upon the infamy of her sex. She carried a dilapidated paper-covered bonnet-box, which she submitted to Robert's inspection. Mr. Audley knelt down to examine the scraps of railway labels and addresses which were pasted here and there upon the box. It had been battered upon a great many different lines of railway, and had evidently travelled considerably. Many of the labels had been torn off, but fragments of some of them remained, and upon one yellow scrap of paper Robert read the letters T-U-R-I. "This box has been to Italy," he thought. "Those are the first 4 letters of the word Turin, and the label is a foreign one." The only direction which had not been either defaced or torn away was the last, which bore the name of Miss Graham, passenger to London. Looking very closely at this label, Mr. Audley discovered that it had been pasted over another. "Will you be so good as to let me have a little water and a piece of sponge?" he said. "I want to get off this upper label. Believe me that I am justified in what I am doing." Miss Tonks ran out of the room and returned immediately with a basin of water and a sponge. "Shall I take off the label?" she asked. "No, thank you," Robert answered coldly. "I can do it very well myself." He damped the upper label several times before he could loosen the edges of the paper, but after 2 or 3 careful attempts the moistened surface peeled off, without injury to the underneath address. Miss Tonks could not contrive to read this address across Robert's shoulder, though she exhibited considerable dexterity in her endeavors to accomplish that object. Mr. Audley repeated his operations upon the lower label, which he removed from the box and placed very carefully between 2 blank leaves of his pocket-book. "I need intrude upon you no longer, ladies," he said when he had done this. "I am extremely obliged to you for having afforded me all the information in your power. I wish you good morning." Mrs. Vincent smiled and bowed, murmuring some complacent conventionality about the delight she had felt in Mr. Audley's visit. Miss Tonks, more observant, stared at the white change which had come over the young man's face since he had removed the upper label from the box. Robert walked slowly away from Acacia Cottage. "If that which I have found today is no evidence for a jury," he thought, "it is surely enough to convince my uncle that he has married a designing and infamous woman." End of chapter 26. of Lady Audley's Secret. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 27. Beginning at the Other End. Robert Audley walked slowly through the leafless grove, under the bare and shadowless trees in the gray February atmosphere, thinking as he went of the discovery he had just made. "I have that in my pocket-book," he pondered, "which forms the connecting link between the woman whose death George Talboys read of in the Times newspaper, and the woman who rules in my uncle's house. The history of Lucy Graham ends abruptly on the threshold of Mrs. Vincent's school. She entered that establishment in August, 1854. The schoolmistress and her assistant can tell me this, but they cannot tell me whence she came. They cannot give me one clue to the secrets of her life from the day of her birth until the day she entered that house. I can go no further in this backward investigation of my lady's antecedents. What am I to do, then, if I mean to keep my promise to Clara Talboys?" He walked on for a few paces, revolving this question in his mind, with a darker shadow than the shadows of the gathering winter twilight on his face, and a heavy oppression of mingled sorrow and dread weighing down his heart. "My duty is clear enough," he thought, "not the less clear because it leads me step by step, carrying ruin and desolation with me, to the home I love. I must begin at the other end. I must begin at the other end and discover the history of Helen Talboys from the hour of George's departure until the day of the funeral in the churchyard at Ventnor." Mr. Audley hailed a passing hansom, and drove back to his chambers. He reached Figtree Court in time to write a few lines to Miss Talboys, and to post his letter at St. Martin's le Grand off before 6 o'clock. "It will save me a day," he thought, as he drove to the General Post Office with this brief epistle. He had written to Clara Talboys to inquire the name of the little seaport town in which George had met Captain Maldon and his daughter, for in spite of the intimacy between the two young men, Robert Audley knew very few particulars of his friend's brief married life. From the hour in which George Talboys had read the announcement of his wife's death in the columns of the Times, he had avoided all mention of the tender history which had been so cruelly broken, the familiar record which had been so darkly blotted out. There was so much that was painful in that brief story. There was such bitter self-reproach involved in the recollection of that desertion which must have seemed so cruel to her who waited and watched at home. Robert Audley comprehended this, and he did not wonder at his friend's silence. The sorrowful story had been tacitly avoided by both, and Robert was as ignorant of the unhappy history of this one year in his schoolfellow's life as if they had never lived together in friendly companionship in those snug Temple chambers. The letter, written to Miss Talboys by her brother George, within a month of his marriage, was dated Harrogate. It was at Harrogate, therefore, Robert concluded, the young couple spent their honeymoon. Robert Audley had requested Clara Talboys to telegraph an answer to this question, in order to avoid the loss of a day in the accomplishment of the investigation he had promised to perform. The telegraphic answer reached Figtree Court before 12 o'clock the next day. The name of the seaport town was Wildernsea, Yorkshire. Within an hour of the receipt of this message, Mr. Audley arrived at the King's Cross station, and took his ticket for Wildernsea by an express train that started at 2:15. The shrieking engine bore him on the dreary northward journey, whirling him over desert wastes of flat meadowland and bare cornfields, faintly tinted with fresh sprouting green. This northern road was strange and unfamiliar to the young barrister, and the wide expanse of the wintry landscape chilled him by its aspect of bare loneliness. The knowledge of the purpose of his journey blighted every object upon which his absent glances fixed themselves for a moment, only to wander wearily away, only to turn inward upon that far darker picture always presenting itself to his anxious mind. It was dark when the train reached the Hull terminus, but Mr. Audley's journey was not ended. Amidst a crowd of porters and scattered heaps of that incongruous and heterogeneous luggage with which travelers encumber themselves, he was led, bewildered and half asleep, to another train which was to convey him along the branch line that swept past Wildernsea and skirted the border of the German Ocean. Half an hour after leaving Hull, Robert felt the briny freshness of the sea upon the breeze that blew in at the open window of the carriage, and an hour afterward the train stopped at a melancholy station, built amid a sandy desert, and inhabited by 2 or 3 gloomy officials, one of whom rung a terrific peal upon a harshly clanging bell as the train approached. Mr. Audley was the only passenger who alighted at the dismal station. The train swept on to the gayer scenes before the barrister had time to collect his senses, or to pick up the portmanteau which had been discovered with some difficulty amid a black cavern of baggage only illuminated by one lantern. "I wonder whether settlers in the backwoods of America feel as solitary and strange as I feel tonight," he thought, as he stared hopelessly about him in the darkness. He called to one of the officials and pointed to his portmanteau. "Will you carry that to the nearest hotel for me?" he said. "That is to say, if I can get a good bed there." The man laughed as he shouldered the portmanteau. "You can get 30 beds, I dare say, sir, if you wanted 'em," he said. "We ain't over busy at Wildernsea at this time of year. This way, sir." The porter opened a wooden door in the station wall, and Robert Audley found himself upon a wide bowling green of smooth grass, which surrounded a huge square building that loomed darkly on him through the winter's night, its black solidity only relieved by 2 lighted windows, far apart from each other, and glimmering redly like beacons on the darkness. "This is the Victoria Hotel, sir," said the porter. "You wouldn't believe the crowds of company we have down here in the summer." In the face of the bare grass plot, the tenantless wooden alcoves, and the dark windows of the hotel, it was indeed rather difficult to imagine that the place was ever gay with merry people taking pleasure in the bright summer weather. But Robert Audley declared himself willing to believe anything the porter pleased to tell him, and followed his guide meekly to a little door at the side of the big hotel, which led into a comfortable bar, where the humbler class of summer visitors were accommodated with such refreshments as they pleased to pay for, without running the gauntlet of the prim white-waistcoated waiters on guard at the principal entrance. But there were very few attendants retained at the hotel in the bleak February season, and it was the landlord himself who ushered Robert into a dreary wilderness of polished mahogany tables and horsehair-cushioned chairs, which he called the coffee-room. Mr. Audley seated himself close to the wide steel fender, and stretched his cramped legs upon the hearthrug, while the landlord drove the poker into the vast pile of coal, and sent a ruddy blaze roaring upward through the chimney. "If you would prefer a private room, sir," the man began. "No, thank you," said Robert indifferently. "This room seems quite private enough just now. If you will order me a mutton chop and a pint of sherry, I shall be obliged." "Certainly, sir." "And I shall be still more obliged if you will favor me with a few minutes' conversation before you do so." "With very great pleasure, sir," the landlord answered good-naturedly. "We see so very little company at this season of the year that we are only too glad to oblige those gentlemen who do visit us. Any information which I can afford you respecting the neighborhood of Wildernsea and its attractions," added the landlord, unconsciously quoting a small handbook of the watering place which he sold in the bar, "I shall be most happy to—" "But I don't want to know anything about the neighborhood of Wildernsea," interrupted Robert, with a feeble protest against the landlord's volubility. "I want to ask you a few questions about some people who once lived here." The landlord bowed and smiled, with an air which implied his readiness to recite the biographies of all the inhabitants of the little seaport, if required by Mr. Audley to do so. "How many years have you lived here?" Robert asked, taking his memorandum book from his pocket. "Will it annoy you if I make notes of your replies to my questions?" "Not at all, sir," replied the landlord, with a pompous enjoyment of the air of solemnity and importance which pervaded this business. "Any information which I can afford that is likely to be of ultimate value—" "Yes, thank you," Robert murmured, interrupting the flow of words. "You have lived here—" "6 years, sir." "Since the year '53?" "Since November in the year '52, sir. I was in business in Hull prior to that time. This house was only completed in the October before I entered it." "Do you remember a lieutenant in the navy, on half pay, I believe, at that time, called Maldon?" "Captain Maldon, sir?" "Yes, commonly called Captain Maldon. I see you do remember him." "Yes, sir, Captain Maldon was one of our best customers. He used to spend his evenings in this very room, though the walls were damp at that time, and we weren't able to paper the place for nearly a 12-month afterward. His daughter married a young officer that came here with his regiment at Christmas time in '52. They were married here, sir, and they traveled on the continent for 6 months, and came back here again. But the gentleman ran away to Australia, and left the lady a week or 2 after her baby was born. The business made quite a sensation in Wildernsea, sir, and Mrs. I forgot the name." "Mrs. Talboys," suggested Robert. "To be sure, sir, Mrs. Talboys. Mrs. Talboys was very much pitied by the Wildernsea folks, sir. I was going to say, for she was very pretty, and had such nice winning ways that she was a favorite with everybody who knew her." "Can you tell me how long Mr. Maldon and his daughter remained at Wildernsea after Mr. Talboys left them?" Robert asked. "Well, no, sir," answered the landlord, after a few moments' deliberation. "I can't say exactly how long it was. I know Mr. Maldon used to sit here in this very parlor, and tell people how badly his daughter had been treated, and how he'd been deceived by a young man he'd put so much confidence in; but I can't say how long it was before he left Wildernsea. But Mrs. Barkamb could tell you, sir," added the landlord briskly. "Mrs. Barkamb?" "Yes, Mrs. Barkamb is the person who owns No. 17 North Cottages, the house in which Mr. Maldon and his daughter lived. She's a nice, civil-spoken, motherly woman, sir, and I'm sure she'll tell you anything you may want to know." "Thank you. I will call upon Mrs. Barkamb tomorrow. Stay, one more question. Should you recognize Mrs. Talboys if you were to see her?" "Certainly, sir, as sure as I should recognize one of my own daughters." Robert Audley wrote Mrs. Barkamb's address in his pocket-book, ate his solitary dinner, drank a couple of glasses of sherry, smoked a cigar, and then retired to the apartment in which a fire had been lighted for his comfort. He soon fell asleep, worn out with the fatigue of hurrying from place to place during the last 2 days, but his slumber was not a heavy one, and he heard the disconsolate moaning of the wind upon the sandy wastes, and the long waves rolling in monotonously upon the flat shore. Mingling with these dismal sounds, the melancholy thoughts engendered by his joyless journey repeated themselves in never-varying succession in the chaos of his slumbering brain, and made themselves into visions of things that never had been and never could be upon this earth, but which had some vague relation to real events remembered by the sleeper. In those troublesome dreams he saw Audley Court, rooted up from amidst the green pastures and the shady hedgerows of Essex, standing bare and unprotected upon that desolate northern shore, threatened by the rapid rising of a boisterous sea, whose waves seemed gathering upward to descend and crush the house he loved. As the hurrying waves rolled nearer and nearer to the stately mansion, the sleeper saw a pale, starry face looking out of the silvery foam, and knew that it was my lady, transformed into a mermaid, beckoning his uncle to destruction. Beyond that rising sea great masses of cloud, blacker than the blackest ink, more dense than the darkest night, lowered upon the dreamer's eye. But as he looked at the dismal horizon, the storm clouds slowly parted, and from a narrow rent in the darkness a ray of light streamed out upon the hideous waves, which slowly, very slowly, receded, leaving the old mansion safe and firmly rooted on the shore. Robert awoke with the memory of this dream in his mind, and a sensation of physical relief, as if some heavy weight, which had oppressed him all the night, had been lifted from his breast. He fell asleep again, and did not awake until the broad winter sunlight shone upon the window blind, and the shrill voice of the chambermaid at his door announced that it was 8:30. At 10:15 he had left Victoria Hotel, and was making his way along the lonely platform in front of a row of shadowless houses that faced the sea. This row of hard, uncompromising, square-built habitations stretched away to the little harbor, in which 2 or 3 merchant vessels and a couple of colliers were anchored. Beyond the harbor there loomed, gray and cold upon the wintry horizon, a dismal barrack, parted from the Wildernsea houses by a narrow creek, spanned by an iron drawbridge. The scarlet coat of the sentinel who walked backward and forward between 2 cannons, placed at remote angles before the barrack wall, was the only scrap of color that relieved the neutral-tinted picture of the gray stone houses and the leaden sea. On one side of the harbor a long stone pier stretched out far away into the cruel loneliness of the sea, as if built for the especial accommodation of some modern Timon, too misanthropical to be satisfied even with the solitude of Wildernsea, and anxious to get still further away from his fellow creatures. It was on that pier George Talboys had first met his wife, under the blazing glory of a midsummer sky, and to the music of a braying band. It was there that the young cornet had first yielded to that sweet delusion, that fatal infatuation which had exercised so dark an influence upon his after-life. Robert looked savagely at this solitary watering-place, the shabby seaport. "It is such a place as this," he thought, "that works a strong man's ruin. He comes here, heart-whole and happy, with no better experience of women than is to be learned at a flower show or in a ball-room, with no more familiar knowledge of the creature than he has of the far-away satellites or the remoter planets,
with a vague notion that she is a whirling teetotum in pink and blue gauze, or a graceful automaton for the display of milliners' manufacture. He comes to some place of this kind, and the universe is suddenly narrowed into about a half-dozen acres, the mighty scheme of creation is crushed into a bandbox. The far-away creatures whom he had seen floating about him, beautiful and indistinct, are brought under his very nose, and before he has time to recover his bewilderment, hey presto, the witchcraft has begun, the magic circle is drawn around him, the spells are at work, the whole formula of sorcery is in full play, and the victim is as powerless to escape as the marble-legged prince in the Eastern story. Ruminating in this wise, Robert Audley reached the house to which he had been directed as the residence of Mrs. Barkamb. He was admitted immediately by a prim, elderly servant, who ushered him into a sitting-room as prim and elderly-looking as herself. Mrs. Barkamb, a comfortable matron of about 60 years of age, was sitting in an arm-chair before a bright handful of fire in the shining grate. An elderly terrier, whose black and tan coat was thickly sprinkled with gray, reposed in Mrs. Barkamb's lap. Every object in the quiet sitting-room had an elderly aspect of simple comfort and precision, which is the evidence of outward repose. "I should like to live here," Robert thought, "and watch the gray sea slowly rolling over the gray sand under the still gray sky. I should like to live here, and tell the beads upon my rosary, and repent and rest." He seated himself in the arm-chair opposite Mrs. Barkamb, at that lady's invitation, and placed his hat upon the ground. The elderly terrier descended from his mistress's lap to bark at and otherwise take objection to this hat. "You were wishing, I suppose, sir, to take one—" "Be quiet, Dash!" "One of the cottages," suggested Mrs. Barkamb, whose mind ran in one narrow groove, and whose life during the last 20 years had been an unvarying round of house-letting. Robert Audley explained the purpose of his visit. "I come to ask one simple question," he said, in conclusion. "I wish to discover the exact date of Mrs. Talboys' departure from Wildernsea. The proprietor of the Victoria Hotel informed me that you were the most likely person to afford me that information." Mrs. Barkamb deliberated for some moments. "I can give you the date of Captain Maldon's departure," she said, "for he left number 17 considerably in my debt, and I have the whole business in black and white. But with regard to Mrs. Talboys—" Mrs. Barkamb paused for a few moments before resuming. "You are aware that Mrs. Talboys left rather abruptly?" she asked. "I was not aware of that fact." "Indeed. Yes, she left abruptly, poor little woman. She tried to support herself after her husband's desertion by giving music lessons. She was a very brilliant pianist, and succeeded pretty well, I believe. But I suppose her father took her money from her, and spent it in public houses. However that might be, they had a very serious misunderstanding one night, and the next morning Mrs. Talboys left Wildernsea, leaving her little boy, who was out at nurse in the neighborhood." "But you cannot tell me the date of her leaving?" "I'm afraid not," answered Mrs. Barkamb. "And yet stay. Captain Maldon wrote to me upon the day his daughter left. He was in very great distress, poor old gentleman, and he always came to me in his troubles. If I could find that letter, it might be dated, you know. Mightn't it now?" Mr. Audley said that it was only probable the letter was dated. Mrs. Barkamb retired to a table in the window on which stood an old-fashioned mahogany desk, lined with green baize, and suffering from a plethora of documents, which oozed out of it in every direction. Letters, receipts, bills, inventories, and tax papers were mingled in hopeless confusion, and among these Mrs. Barkamb set to work to search for Captain Maldon's letter. Mr. Audley waited very patiently, watching the gray clouds sailing across the gray sky, the gray vessels gliding past upon the gray sea. After about 10 minutes' search, and a great deal of rustling, crackling, folding and unfolding of the papers, Mrs. Barkamb uttered an exclamation of triumph. "I've got the letter," she said, "and there's a note inside it from Mrs. Talboys." Robert Audley's pale face flushed a vivid crimson as he stretched out his hand to receive the papers. "The persons who stole Helen Maldon's love letters from George's trunk in my chambers might well have saved themselves the trouble," he thought. The letter from the old lieutenant was not long, but almost every other word was underscored. "My generous friend," the writer began. Mr. Maldon had tried the lady's generosity pretty severely during his residence in her house, rarely paying his rent until threatened with the intruding presence of the broker's man. "I am in the depths of despair. My daughter has left me. You may imagine my feelings. We had a few words last night upon the subject of money matters, which subject has always been a disagreeable one between us, and on rising this morning I found I was deserted. The enclosed from Helen was waiting for me on the parlor table. Yours in distraction and despair, Henry Malden, North Cottages, August 16th, 1854.
The note from Mrs. Talboys was still more brief. It began abruptly thus: I am weary of my life here, and wish, if I can, to find a new one. I go out into the world, dissevered from every link which binds me to the hateful past, to seek another home and another fortune. Forgive me if I have been fretful, capricious, changeable. You should forgive me, for you know why I have been so. You know the secret which is the key to my life. Helen Talboys. These lines were written in a hand that Robert Audley knew only too well. He sat for a long time pondering silently over the letter written by Helen Talboys. What was the meaning of those last two sentences? You should forgive me, for you know why I have been so. You know the secret which is the key to my life. He wearied his brain in endeavoring to find a clue to the signification of these two sentences. He could remember nothing, nor could he imagine anything that would throw a light upon their meaning. The date of Helen's departure, according to Mr. Malden's letter, was the 16th of August, 1854. Miss Tonks had declared that Lucy Graham entered the school at Crescent Villas upon the 17th or 18th of August in the same year. Between the departure of Helen Talboys from the Yorkshire watering place and the arrival of Lucy Graham at the Brompton school, not more than 48 hours could have elapsed. This made a very small link in the chain of circumstantial evidence, perhaps, but it was a link none the less, and it fitted neatly into its place.
Did Mr. Malden hear from his daughter after she had left Wildersie?
Robert asked. Well, I believe he did hear from her, Mrs. Barkamb answered. But I didn't see much of the old gentleman after that August. I was obliged to sell him up in November, poor fellow, for he owed me 15 months' rent, and it was only by selling his poor little bits of furniture that I could get him out of my place. We parted very good friends, in spite of my sending in the brokers, and the old gentleman went to London with the child, who was scarcely a 12-month old. Mrs. Barkamb had nothing more to tell, and Robert had no further questions to ask. He requested permission to retain the 2 letters written by the lieutenant and his daughter, and left the house with them in his pocket-book. He walked straight back to the hotel, where he called for a timetable. An express for London left Wildernsea at 1:15. Robert sent his portmanteau to the station, paid his bill, and walked up and down the stone terrace fronting the sea, waiting for the starting of the train.
I have traced the histories of Lucy Graham and Helen Talboys to a vanishing point, he thought. My next business is to discover the history of the woman who lies buried in Ventnor churchyard.
End of chapter 27. Of Lady Audley's Secret. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 28. Hidden in the Grave. Upon his return from Wildernsea, Robert Audley found a letter from his cousin Alicia awaiting him at his chambers. Papa is much better, the young lady wrote, and is very anxious to have you at the court. For some inexplicable reason, my stepmother has taken it into her head that your presence is extremely desirable, and worries me with her frivolous questions about your movements. So pray come without delay and set these people at rest. Your affectionate cousin, A.A.
So my lady is anxious to know my movements, thought Robert Audley, as he sat brooding and smoking by his lonely fireside. She is anxious, and she questions her stepdaughter in that pretty, childlike manner which has such a bewitching air of innocent frivolity. Poor little creature! Poor, unhappy little golden-haired sinner! The battle between us seems terribly unfair. Why doesn't she run away while there is still time? I have given her fair warning. I have shown her my cards, and worked openly enough in this business, heaven knows. Why doesn't she run away?
He repeated this question again and again as he filled and emptied his meerschaum, surrounding himself with the blue vapor from his pipe until he looked like some modern magician seated in his laboratory.
Why doesn't she run away? I would bring no needless shame upon that house, of all other houses upon this wide earth. I would only do my duty to my missing friend, and to that brave and generous man who has pledged his faith to a worthless woman. Heaven knows I have no wish to punish. Heaven knows I was never born to be the avenger of guilt or the persecutor of the guilty. I only wish to do my duty. I will give her one more warning, a full and fair one, and then—" His thoughts wandered away to that gloomy prospect in which he saw no gleam of brightness to relieve the dull, black obscurity that encompassed the future, shutting in his pathway on every side, and spreading a dense curtain around and about him, which hope was powerless to penetrate. He was forever haunted by the vision of his uncle's anguish, forever tortured by the thought of that ruin and desolation, which, being brought about by his instrumentality, would seem in a manner his handiwork. But amid all, and through all, Clara Talboys, with an imperious gesture, beckoned him onward to her brother's unknown grave. "Shall I go down to Southampton," he thought, "and endeavor to discover the history of the woman who died at Ventnor? Shall I work underground, bribing the paltry assistants in that foul conspiracy, until I find my way to the thrice guilty principal? No, not till I have tried other means of discovering the truth. Shall I go to that miserable old man, and charge him with his share in the shameful trick which I believe to have been played upon my poor friend? No, I will not torture that terror-stricken wretch as I tortured him a few weeks ago. I will go straight to that arch-conspirator, and will tear away the beautiful veil under which she hides her wickedness, and will wring from her the secret of my friend's fate, and banish her forever from the house which her presence has polluted." He started early the next morning for Essex, and reached Audley before 11 o'clock. Early as it was, my lady was out. She had driven to Chelmsford upon a shopping expedition with her stepdaughter. She had several calls to make in the neighborhood of the town, and was not likely to return until dinner time. Sir Michael's health was very much improved, and he would come downstairs in the afternoon. Would Mr. Audley go to his uncle's room? No, Robert had no wish to meet that generous kinsman. What could he say to him? How could he smooth the way for the trouble that was to come? How soften the cruel blow of the great grief that was preparing for that noble and trusting heart? "If I could forgive her the wrong done to my friend," Robert thought, "I should still abhor her for the misery her guilt must bring upon the man who has believed in her." He told his uncle's servant that he would stroll into the village and return before dinner. He walked slowly away from the Court, wandering across the meadows between his uncle's house and the village, purposeless and indifferent, with the great trouble and perplexity of his life stamped upon his face and reflected in his manner. "I will go into the churchyard," he thought, "and stare at the tombstones. There is nothing I can do that will make me more gloomy than I am." He was in those very meadows through which he had hurried from Audley Court to the station upon the September day in which George Talboys had disappeared. He looked at the pathway by which she had gone upon that day, and remembered his unaccustomed hurry, and the vague feeling of terror which had taken possession of him immediately upon losing sight of his friend. "Why did that unaccountable terror seize upon me?" he thought. "Why was it that I saw some strange mystery in my friend's disappearance? Was it a monition, or a monomania? What if I am wrong, after all? What if this chain of evidence which I have constructed link by link is woven out of my own folly? What if this edifice of horror and suspicion is a mere collection of crotchets, the nervous fancies of a hypochondriacal bachelor? Mr. Harcourt Talboys sees no meanings in the events out of which I have made myself a horrible mystery. I lay the separate links of the chain before him, and he cannot recognize their fitness. He is unable to put them together. Oh, my God! If it should be in myself all this time that the misery lies, if—" he smiled bitterly, and shook his head. "I have the handwriting in my pocket-book which is the evidence of the conspiracy," he thought. "It remains for me to discover the darker half of my lady's secret." He avoided the village, still keeping to the meadows. The church lay a little way back from the straggling High Street, and a rough wooden gate opened from the churchyard into a broad meadow that was bordered by a running stream, and sloped down into a grassy valley dotted by groups of cattle. Robert slowly ascended the narrow hillside pathway leading up to the gate in the churchyard. The quiet dullness of the lonely landscape harmonized with his own gloom. The solitary figure of an old man hobbling toward a stile at the further end of the wide meadow was the only human creature visible upon the area over which the young barrister looked.
The smoke slowly ascending from the scattered houses in the long High Street was the only evidence of human life. The slow progress of the hands of the old clock in the church steeple was the only token by which a traveler could perceive that a sluggish course of rustic life had not come to a full stop in the village of Audley. Yes, there was one other sign. As Robert opened the gate of the churchyard, and strolled listlessly into the little enclosure, he became aware of the solemn music of an organ, audible through a half-open window in the steeple. He stopped and listened to the slow harmonies of a dreamy melody that sounded like an extempore composition of an accomplished player. "Who would have believed that Audley Church could boast such an organ?" thought Robert. "When last I was here, the national schoolmaster used to accompany his children by a primitive performance of common chords. I didn't think the old organ had such music in it." He lingered at the gate, not caring to break the lazy spell woven about him by the monotonous melancholy of the organist's performance. The tones of the instrument, now swelling to their fullest power, now sinking to a low, whispering softness, floated toward him upon the misty winter atmosphere, and had a soothing influence, that seemed to comfort him in his trouble. He closed the gate softly, and crossed the little patch of gravel before the door of the church. The door had been left ajar, by the organist perhaps. Robert Audley pushed it open, and walked into the square porch, from which a flight of narrow stone steps wound upward to the organ loft and the belfry. Mr. Audley took off his hat, and opened the door between the porch and the body of the church. He stepped softly into the holy edifice, which had a damp, mouldy smell upon week-days. He walked down the narrow aisle to the altar rails, and from that point of observation took a survey of the church. The little gallery was exactly opposite to him, but the scanty green curtains before the organ were closely drawn, and he could not get a glimpse of the player. The music still rolled on. The organist had wandered into a melody of Mendelssohn's, a strain whose dreamy sadness went straight to Robert's heart. He loitered in the nooks and corners of the church, examining the dilapidated memorials of the well-nigh forgotten dead, and listening to the music. "If my poor friend George Talboys had died in my arms, and I had buried him in this quiet church, in one corner of the vaults over which I tread today, how much anguish of mind, vacillation, and torment I might have escaped," thought Robert Audley, as he read the faded inscriptions upon tablets of discolored marble. "I should have known his fate. I should have known his fate. Ah, how much there would have been in that! It is this miserable uncertainty, this horrible suspicion which has poisoned my very life." He looked at his watch. "1:30, he muttered. "I shall have to wait 4 or 5 dreary hours before my lady comes home from her morning calls, her pretty visits of ceremony or friendliness. Good heaven, what an actress this woman is! What an arch trickster, what an all-accomplished deceiver! But she shall play her pretty comedy no longer under my uncle's roof. I have diplomatized long enough. She has refused to accept an indirect warning. Tonight I will speak plainly." The music of the organ ceased, and Robert heard the closing of the instrument. "I'll have a look at this new organist," he thought, "who can afford to bury his talents at Audley, and play Mendelssohn's finest fugues for a stipend of £16 a year." He lingered in the porch, waiting for the organist to descend the awkward little staircase. In the weary trouble of his mind, and with the prospect of getting through the 5 hours in the best way he could, Mr. Audley was glad to cultivate any diversion of thought, however idle. He therefore freely indulged his curiosity about the new organist. The first person who appeared upon the steep stone steps was a boy in corduroy trousers and a dark linen smock-frock, who shambled down the stairs with a good deal of unnecessary clatter of his hobnailed shoes, and who was red in the face from the exertion of blowing the bellows of the old organ. Close behind this boy came a young lady, very plainly dressed in a black silk gown and a large gray shawl, who started and turned pale at sight of Mr. Audley. This young lady was Clara Talboys. Of all people in the world, she was the last whom Robert either expected or wished to see. She had told him that she was going to pay a visit to some friends who lived in Essex, but the county is a wide one, and the village of Audley one of the most obscure and least frequented spots in the whole of its extent. That the sister of his lost friend should be here where she could watch his every action, and from those actions deduce the secret workings of his mind, tracing his doubts home to their object, made a complication of all his difficulties that he could never have anticipated. It brought him back to that consciousness of his own helplessness, in which he had exclaimed,
A hand that is stronger than my own is beckoning me onward, on the dark road that leads to my lost friend's unknown grave."
Clara Talboys was the first to speak. "You are surprised to see me here, Mr. Audley," she said.
"Very much surprised."
"I told you that I was coming to Essex. I left home day before yesterday. I was leaving home when I received your telegraphic message. The friend with whom I am staying is Mrs. Martin, the wife of the new rector of Mount Stanning. I came down this morning to see the village and the church, and as Mrs. Martin had to pay a visit to the school with the curate and his wife, I stopped here and amused myself by trying the old organ. I was not aware till I came here that there was a village called Audley. The place takes its name from your family, I suppose."
"I believe so,"
Robert answered, wondering at the lady's calmness, in contradistinction to his own embarrassment.
"I have a vague recollection of hearing the story of some ancestor who was called Audley of Audley in the reign of Edward the Fourth. The tomb inside the rails near the altar belongs to one of the knights of Audley, but I have never taken the trouble to remember his achievements. Are you going to wait here for your friends, Miss Talboys?"
"Yes, they are to return here for me after they have finished their rounds."
"And you go back to Mount Stanning with them this afternoon?"
"Yes." Robert stood with his hat in his hand, looking absently out at the tombstones and the low wall of the churchyard. Clara Talboys watched his pale face, haggard under the deepening shadow that had rested upon it for so long. "You have been ill since I last saw you, Mr. Audley," she said, in a low voice, that had the same melodious sadness as the notes of the old organ under her touch.
"No, I have not been ill. I have been only harassed, wearied by 100 doubts and perplexities."
He was thinking as he spoke to her.
"How much does she guess? How much does she suspect?"
He had told the story of George's disappearance and of his own suspicions, suppressing only the names of those concerned in the mystery. But what if this girl should fathom this slender disguise, and discover for herself that which he had chosen to withhold? Her grave eyes were fixed upon his face, and he knew that she was trying to read the innermost secrets of his mind.
"What am I in her hands?" he thought. "What am I in the hands of this woman, who has my lost friend's face in the manner of Pallas Athena? She reads my pitiful, vacillating soul, and plucks the thoughts out of my heart with the magic of her solemn brown eyes. How unequal the fight must be between us, and how can I ever hope to conquer against the strength of her beauty and her wisdom?"
Mr. Audley was clearing his throat preparatory to bidding this beautiful companion good morning, and making his escape from the thraldom of her presence into the lonely meadow outside the churchyard, when Clara Talboys arrested him by speaking upon that very subject which he was most anxious to avoid. "You promised to write to me, Mr. Audley," she said, "if you made any discovery which carried you nearer to the mystery of my brother's disappearance. You have not written to me, and I imagine, therefore, that you have discovered nothing." Robert Audley was silent for some moments. How could he answer this direct question?
"The chain of circumstantial evidence which unites the mystery of your brother's fate with the person whom I suspect," he said, after a pause, "is formed of very slight links. I think that I have added another link in that chain since I saw you in Dorsetshire."
"And you refuse to tell me what it is that you have discovered?"
"Only until I have discovered more."
"I thought from your message that you were going to Wildersie."
"I have been there."
"Indeed. It was there that you made some discovery, then?"
"It was," answered Robert. "You must remember, Miss Talboys, that the sole ground upon which my suspicions rest is the identity of two individuals who have no apparent connection, the identity of a person who is supposed to be dead, with one who is living. The conspiracy of which I believe your brother to have been the victim hinges upon this. If his wife, Helen Talboys, died when the papers recorded her death, if the woman who lies buried in Ventnor churchyard was indeed the woman whose name is inscribed on the headstone of the grave, I have no case, I have no clue to the mystery of your brother's fate. I am about to put this to the test. I believe that I am now in a position to play a bold game, and I believe that I shall soon arrive at the truth." He spoke in a low voice, and with a solemn emphasis that betrayed the intensity of his feeling. Miss Talboys stretched out her ungloved hand and laid it in his own. The cold touch of that slender hand sent a shivering thrill through his frame. "You will not suffer my brother's fate to remain a mystery, Mr. Audley," she said quietly. "I know that you will do your duty to your friend."
The rector's wife and her two companions entered the churchyard as Clara Talboys said this. Robert Audley pressed the hand that rested in his own, and raised it to his lips. "I am a lazy, good-for-nothing fellow, Miss Talboys," he said; "but if I could restore your brother George to life and happiness, I should care very little for any sacrifice of my own fear that the most I can do is to fathom the secret of his fate, and in doing that I must sacrifice those who are dearer to me than myself." He put on his hat, and hurried through the gateway leading into the field as Mrs. Martin came up to the porch. "Who is that handsome young man I caught tête-à-tête with you, Clara?" she asked, laughing. "He is Mr. Audley, a friend of my poor brother's." "Indeed! He is some relation of Sir Michael Audley, I suppose." "Sir Michael Audley?" "Yes, my dear, the most important personage in the parish of Audley. But we'll call at the Court in a day or two, and you shall see the baronet and his pretty young wife." "His young wife?" replied Clara Talboys, looking earnestly at her friend. "Has Sir Michael Audley lately married, then?" "Yes. He was a widower for 16 years, and married a penniless young governess about a year and a half ago. The story is quite romantic, and Lady Audley is considered the belle of the county. But come, my dear Clara, the pony is tired of waiting for us, and we've a long drive before dinner." Clara Talboys took her seat in the little basket carriage which was waiting at the principal gate of the churchyard, in the care of the boy who had blown the organ bellows. Mrs. Martin shook the reins, and the sturdy chestnut cob trotted off in the direction of Mount Stanning. "Will you tell me more about this Lady Audley, Fanny?" Miss Talboys said after a long pause. "I want to know all about her. Have you heard her maiden name?" "Yes, she was a Miss Graham." "And she is very pretty?" "Yes, very, very pretty. Rather a childish beauty, though, with large, clear blue eyes and pale golden ringlets that fall in a feathery shower over her throat and shoulders." Clara Talboys was silent. She did not ask any further questions about my lady. She was thinking of a passage in that letter which George had written to her during his honeymoon, a passage in which he said, "My childish little wife is watching me as I write this. Ah, how I wish you could see her, Clara. Her eyes are as blue and as clear as the skies on a bright summer's day, and her hair falls about her face like the pale golden halo you see round the head of a Madonna in an Italian picture." End of chapter 28. Of Lady Audley's Secret. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 29. In the Lime Walk. Robert Audley was loitering upon the broad grass plat in front of the Court as the carriage containing my lady and Alicia drove under the archway, and drew up at the low turret door. Mr. Audley presented himself in time to hand the ladies out of the vehicle. My lady looked very pretty in a delicate blue bonnet and the sables which her nephew had bought for her at St. Petersburg. She seemed very well pleased to see Robert, and smiled most bewitchingly as she gave him her exquisitely gloved little hand. "So you have come back to us, truant," she said, laughing. "And now that you have returned, we shall keep you prisoner. We won't let him run away again, will we, Alicia?" Miss Audley gave her head a scornful toss that shook the heavy curls under her cavalier hat. "I have nothing to do with the movements of so erratic an individual," she said. "Since Robert Audley has taken it into his head to conduct himself like some ghost-haunted hero in a German story, I have given up attempting to understand him." Mr. Audley looked at his cousin with an expression of serio-comic perplexity. "She's a nice girl," he thought, "but she's a nuisance. I don't know how it is, but she seems more a nuisance than she used to be." He pulled his mustaches reflectively as he considered this question. His mind wandered away for a few moments from the great trouble of his life to dwell upon this minor perplexity. "She's a dear girl," he thought, "a generous-hearted, bouncing, noble English lassie, and yet—" He lost himself in a quagmire of doubt and difficulty. There was some hitch in his mind which he could not understand, some change in himself, beyond the change made in him by his anxiety about George Talboys, which mystified and bewildered him. "And pray where have you been wandering during the last day or two, Mr. Audley?" asked my lady, as she lingered with her stepdaughter upon the threshold of the turret door, waiting until Robert should be pleased to stand aside and allow them to pass. The young man started as she asked this question, and looked up at her suddenly. Something in the aspect of her bright young beauty, something in the childish innocence of her expression, seemed to smite him to the heart, and his face grew ghastly pale as he looked at her. "I have been in Yorkshire," he said, "at the little watering place where my poor friend George Talboys lived at the time of his marriage." The white change in my lady's face was the only sign of her having heard these words. She smiled, a faint, sickly smile, and tried to pass her husband's nephew. "I must dress for dinner," she said. "I am going to a dinner party, Mr. Audley. Please let me go in." "I must ask you to spare me half an hour, Lady Audley," Robert answered in a low voice. "I came down to Essex on purpose to speak to you." "What about?" asked my lady. She had recovered herself from any shock which she might have sustained a few moments before, and it was in her usual manner that she asked this question. Her face expressed the mingled bewilderment and curiosity of a puzzled child, rather than the serious surprise of a woman. "What can you want to talk to me about, Mr. Audley?" she repeated. "I will tell you when we are alone," Robert said, glancing at his cousin, who stood a little way behind my lady, watching this confidential little dialogue. "He is in love with my stepmother's wax doll beauty," thought Alicia, "and it is for her sake he has become such a disconsolate object. He's just the sort of person to fall in love with his aunt." Miss Audley walked away to the grass plat, turning her back upon Robert and my lady. "The absurd creature turned as white as a sheet when he saw her," she thought. "So he can be in love, after all. That slow lump of torpidity he calls his heart can beat, I suppose, once in a quarter of a century; but it seems that nothing but a blue-eyed wax doll can set it going. I should have given him up long ago if I'd known that his idea of beauty was to be found in a toy shop." Poor Alicia crossed the grass plat and disappeared upon the opposite side of the quadrangle, where there was a Gothic gate that communicated with the stables. I am sorry to say that Sir Michael Audley's daughter went to seek consolation from her dog Caesar and her chestnut mare Atalanta, whose loose box the young lady was in the habit of visiting every day. "Will you come into the lime walk, Lady Audley?" said Robert as his cousin left the garden. "I wish to talk to you without fear of interruption or observation. I think we could choose no safer place than that. Will you come there with me?" "If you please," answered my lady. Mr. Audley could see that she was trembling, and that she glanced from side to side as if looking for some outlet by which she might escape him. "You are shivering, Lady Audley," he said. "Yes, I am very cold. I would rather speak to you some other day, please. Let it be tomorrow, if you will. I have to dress for dinner, and I want to see Sir Michael. I have not seen him since 10 o'clock this morning. Please let it be tomorrow." There was a painful piteousness in her tone. Heaven knows how painful to Robert's heart. Heaven knows what horrible images arose in his mind as he looked down at that fair young face and thought of the task that lay before him. "I must speak to you, Lady Audley," he said. "If I am cruel, it is you who have made me cruel. You might have escaped this ordeal. You might have avoided me. I gave you fair warning. But you have chosen to defy me, and it is your own folly which is to blame if I no longer spare you. Come with me. I tell you again, I must speak to you." There was a cold determination in his tone which silenced my lady's objections. She followed him submissively to the little iron gate which communicated with the long garden behind the house, the garden in which a little rustic wooden bridge led across the quiet fish pond into the lime walk. The early winter twilight was closing in, and the intricate tracery of the leafless branches that overarched the lonely pathway looked black against the cold gray of the evening sky. The lime walk seemed like some cloister in this uncertain light. "Why do you bring me to this horrible place, to frighten me out of my poor wits?" cried my lady peevishly. "You ought to know how nervous I am." "You are nervous, my lady?" "Yes, dreadfully nervous. I am worth a fortune to poor Mr. Dawson. He is always sending me camphor, and sal volatile, and red lavender, and all kinds of abominable mixtures, but he can't cure me."
"Do you remember what Macbeth tells his physician, my lady?" said Robert gravely. "Mr. Dawson may be very much more clever than the Scottish leech, but I doubt if even he can minister to the mind that is diseased."
"Who said that my mind was diseased?" exclaimed Lady Audley.
"I say so, my lady," answered Robert. "You tell me that you are nervous, and that all the medicines your doctor can prescribe are only so much physic that might as well be thrown to the dogs. Let me be the physician to strike to the root of your malady, Lady Audley. Heaven knows that I wish to be merciful, that I would spare you as far as it is in my power to spare you in doing justice to others, but justice must be done. Shall I tell you why you are nervous in this house, my lady?"
"If you can," she answered with a little laugh.
"Because for you this house is haunted."
"Haunted?"
"Yes, haunted by the ghost of George Talboys."
Robert Audley heard my lady's quickened breathing. He fancied he could almost hear the loud beating of her heart as she walked by his side, shivering now and then, and with her sable cloak wrapped tightly around her. "What do you mean?" she cried suddenly after a pause of some moments. "Why do you torment me about this George Talboys, who happens to have taken it into his head to keep out of your way for a few months? Are you going mad, Mr. Audley? And do you select me as the victim of your monomania? What is George Talboys to me that you should worry me about him?"
"He was a stranger to you, my lady, was he not?"
"Of course," answered Lady Audley. "What should he be but a stranger?"
"Shall I tell you the story of my friend's disappearance as I read that story, my lady?" asked Robert.
"No," cried Lady Audley. "I wish to know nothing of your friend. If he is dead, I am sorry for him. If he lives, I have no wish either to see him or to hear of him. Let me go in to see my husband, if you please, Mr. Audley, unless you wish to detain me in this gloomy place until I catch my death of cold."
"I wish to detain you until you have heard what I have to say, Lady Audley," answered Robert resolutely. "I will detain you no longer than is necessary, and when you have heard me you shall take your own course of action."
"Very well, then, pray lose no time in saying what you have to say," replied my lady carelessly. "I promise you to attend very patiently."
"When my friend George Talboys returned to England," Robert began gravely, "the thought which was uppermost in his mind was the thought of his wife."
"Whom he had deserted," said my lady quickly. "At least," she added more deliberately, "I remember you telling us something to that effect when you first told us your friend's story." Robert Audley did not notice this observation.
"The thought that was uppermost in his mind was the thought of his wife," he repeated. "His fairest hope in the future was the hope of making her happy, and lavishing upon her the pittance which he had won by the force of his own strong arm in the gold fields of Australia. I saw him within a few hours of his reaching England, and I was a witness to the joyful pride with which he looked forward to his reunion with his wife. I was also a witness to the blow which struck him to the very heart, which changed him from the man he had been to a creature as unlike that former self as one human being can be unlike another. The blow which made that cruel change was the announcement of his wife's death in the Times newspaper. I now believe that announcement was a black and bitter lie."
"Indeed," said my lady. "And what reason could any one have for announcing the death of Mrs. Talboys, if Mrs. Talboys had been alive?"
"The lady herself might have had a reason," Robert answered quietly.
"What reason?"
"How if she had taken advantage of George's absence to win a richer husband? How if she had married again, and wished to throw my poor friend off the scent by this false announcement?"
Lady Audley shrugged her shoulders. "Your suppositions are rather ridiculous, Mr. Audley," she said. "It is to be hoped that you have some reasonable grounds for them."
"I have examined a file of each of the newspapers published in Chelmsford and Colchester," continued Robert, without replying to my lady's last observation, "and I find in one of the Colchester papers, dated July the 2nd, 1850, a brief paragraph among numerous miscellaneous scraps of information copied from other newspapers, to the effect that a Mr. George Talboys, an English gentleman, had arrived at Sydney from the gold fields, carrying with him nuggets and gold dust to the amount of £20,000, and that he had realized his property and sailed for Liverpool in the fast-sailing clipper Argus. This is a very small fact, of course, Lady Audley, but it is enough to prove that any person residing in Essex in the July of the year '57 was likely to become aware of George Talboys's return from Australia. Do you follow me?"
"Not very clearly," said my lady. "What have the Essex papers to do with the death of Mrs. Talboys?"
"We will come to that by and by, Lady Audley. I say that I believe the announcement in the Times to have been a false announcement, and a part of the conspiracy which was carried out by Helen Talboys and Lieutenant Maldon against my poor friend."
"A conspiracy?"
"Yes, a conspiracy concocted by an artful woman, who had speculated upon the chances of her husband's death, and had secured a splendid position at the risk of committing a crime. A bold woman, my lady, who thought to play her comedy out to the end without fear of detection. A wicked woman, who did not care what misery she might inflict upon the honest heart of the man she betrayed. But a foolish woman, who looked at life as a game of chance, in which the best player was likely to hold the winning cards, forgetting that there is a Providence above the pitiful speculators, and that wicked secrets are never permitted to remain long hidden. If this woman of whom I speak had never been guilty of any blacker sin than the publication of that lying announcement in the Times newspaper, I should still hold her as the most detestable and despicable of her sex, the most pitiless and calculating of human creatures. That cruel lie was a base and cowardly blow in the dark. It was the treacherous dagger thrust of an infamous assassin."
"But how do you know that the announcement was a false one?" asked my lady. "You told us that you had been to Ventnor with Mr. Talboys to see his wife's grave. Who was it who died at Ventnor if it was not Mrs. Talboys?"
"Ah, Lady Audley," said Robert, "that is a question which only 2 or 3 people can answer, and one or other of those persons shall answer it to me before long. I tell you, my lady, that I am determined to unravel the mystery of George Talboys's death. Do you think I am to be put off by feminine prevarication, by womanly trickery? No. Link by link I have put together the chain of evidence, which wants but a link here and there to be complete in its terrible strength. Do you think I will suffer myself to be baffled? Do you think I shall fail to discover those missing links? No, Lady Audley, I shall not fail, for I know where to look for them. There is a fair-haired woman at Southampton, a woman called Plowson, who has had some share in the secrets of the father of my friend's wife. I have an idea that she can help me to discover the history of the woman who lies buried in Ventnor churchyard, and I will spare no trouble in making that discovery, unless—"
"Unless what?" asked my lady eagerly.
"Unless the woman I wish to save from degradation and punishment accepts the mercy I offer her, and takes warning while there is still time."
My lady shrugged her graceful shoulders, and flashed bright defiance out of her blue eyes. "She would be a very foolish woman if she suffered herself to be influenced by any such absurdity," she said. "You are hypochondriacal, Mr. Audley, and you must take camphor, or red lavender, or sal volatile. What can be more ridiculous than this idea which you have taken into your head? You lose your friend George Talboys in rather a mysterious manner; that is to say, that gentleman chooses to leave England without giving you due notice. What of that? You confess that he became an altered man after his wife's death. He grew eccentric and misanthropical. He affected an utter indifference as to what became of him. What more likely, then, that he grew tired of the monotony of civilized life, and ran away to those savage gold fields to find a distraction for his grief? It is rather a romantic story, but by no means an uncommon one. But you are not satisfied with this simple interpretation of your friend's disappearance, and you build up some absurd theory of a conspiracy which has no existence except in your own overheated brain. Helen Talboys is dead. The Times newspaper declares that she is dead. Her own father tells you she is dead. The headstone of the grave in Ventnor churchyard bears record of her death. By what right?" cried my lady, her voice rising to that shrill and piercing tone peculiar to her when affected by any intense agitation. "By what right, Mr. Audley, do you come to me, and torment me about George Talboys? By what right do you dare to say that his wife is still alive?" "By the right of circumstantial evidence, Lady Audley," answered Robert. "By the right of that circumstantial evidence which will sometimes fix the guilt of a man's murder upon that person who, on the first hearing of the case, seems of all other men the most unlikely to be guilty." "What circumstantial evidence?"
"The evidence of time and place. The evidence of handwriting. When Helen Talboys left her father's at Wildernsea, she left a letter behind her. A letter in which she declared that she was weary of her old life, and that she wished to seek a new home and a new fortune. That letter is in my possession." "Indeed?" "Shall I tell you whose handwriting resembles that of Helen Talboys so closely, that the most dexterous expert could perceive no distinction between the two?" "A resemblance between the handwriting of two women is no very uncommon circumstance nowadays," replied my lady carelessly. "I could show you the calligraphies of half a dozen female correspondents, and defy you to discover any great difference in them." "But what if the handwriting is a very uncommon one, presenting marked peculiarities by which it may be recognized among 100?" "Why, in that case the coincidence is rather curious," answered my lady; "but it is nothing more than a coincidence. You cannot deny the fact of Helen Talboys' death on the ground that her handwriting resembles that of some surviving person." "But if a series of such coincidences lead up to the same point," said Robert. "Helen Talboys left her father's house, according to the declaration in her own handwriting, because she was weary of her old life, and wished to begin a new one. Do you know what I infer from this?" My lady shrugged her shoulders. "I have not the least idea," she said; "and as you have detained me in this gloomy place nearly half an hour, I must beg that you will release me, and let me go and dress for dinner." "No, Lady Audley," answered Robert, with a cold sternness that was so strange to him as to transform him into another creature, a pitiless embodiment of justice, a cruel instrument of retribution. "No, Lady Audley," he repeated. "I have told you that womanly prevarication will not help you. I tell you now that defiance will not serve you. I have dealt fairly with you, and have given you fair warning. I gave you indirect notice of your danger 2 months ago." "What do you mean?" asked my lady suddenly. "You did not choose to take that warning, Lady Audley," pursued Robert, "and the time has come in which I must speak very plainly to you. Do you think the gifts which you have played against fortune are to hold you exempt from retribution? No, my lady; your youth and beauty, your grace and refinement, only make the horrible secret of your life more horrible. I tell you that the evidence against you wants only one link to be strong enough for your condemnation, and that link shall be added. Helen Talboys never returned to her father's house. When she deserted that poor old father, she went away from his humble shelter with the declared intention of washing her hands of that old life. What do people generally do when they wish to begin a new existence, to start for a second time in the race of life, free from the encumbrances that had fettered their first journey? They change their names, Lady Audley. Helen Talboys deserted her infant son. She went away from Wildernsea with the predetermination of sinking her identity. She disappeared as Helen Talboys upon the 16th of August, 1854, and upon the 17th of that month she reappeared as Lucy Graham, the friendless girl who undertook a profitless duty in consideration of a home in which she was asked no questions.
"You are mad, Mr. Audley," cried my lady.
"You are mad, and my husband shall protect me from your insolence. What if this Helen Talboys ran away from her home upon one day, and I entered my employer's house upon the next? What does that prove?" "By itself very little," replied Robert Audley, "but with the help of other evidence."
"What evidence?"
"The evidence of 2 labels, pasted one over the other, upon a box left by you in possession of Mrs. Vincent, the upper label bearing the name of Miss Graham, the lower that of Mrs. George Talboys."
My lady was silent. Robert Audley could not see her face in the dusk, but he could see that her 2 small hands were clasped convulsively over her heart, and he knew that the shot had gone home to its mark.
"God help her, poor wretched creature," he thought. "She knows now that she is lost. I wonder if the judges of the land feel as I do now when they put on the black cap and pass sentence of death upon some poor shivering wretch who has never done them any wrong? Do they feel a heroic fervor of virtuous indignation? Or do they suffer this dull anguish which gnaws my vitals as I talk to this helpless woman?"
He walked by my lady's side, silently, for some minutes. They had been pacing up and down the dim avenue, and they were now drawing near the leafless shrubbery at one end of the lime walk, the shrubbery in which the ruined well sheltered its unheeded decay among the tangled masses of briery underwood. A winding pathway, neglected and half choked with weeds, led toward this well. Robert left the lime walk and struck into this pathway. There was more light in the shrubbery than in the avenue, and Mr. Audley wished to see my lady's face. He did not speak until they reached the patch of rank grass beside the well. The massive brickwork had fallen away here and there, and loose fragments of masonry lay buried amidst weeds and briars. The heavy posts which had supported the wooden rollers still remained, but the iron spindle had been dragged from its socket and lay a few paces from the well, rusty, discolored, and forgotten. Robert Audley leaned against one of the moss-grown posts and looked down at my lady's face, very pale in the chill winter twilight. The moon had newly risen, a feebly luminous crescent in the gray heavens, and a faint ghostly light mingled with the misty shadows of the declining day. My lady's face seemed like that face which Robert Audley had seen in his dreams, looking out of the white foam flakes on the green sea waves and luring his uncle to destruction. "Those two labels are in my possession, Lady Audley," he resumed. "I took them from the box left by you at Crescent Villas. I took them in the presence of Mrs. Vincent and Miss Tonks. Have you any proofs to offer against this evidence? You say to me, 'I am Lucy Graham, and I have nothing whatever to do with Helen Talboys.' In that case you will produce witnesses who will declare your antecedents. Where had you been living prior to your appearance at Crescent Villas? You must have friends, relations, connections, who can come forward to prove as much as this for you. If you were the most desolate creature upon this earth, you would be able to point to someone who could identify you with the past." "Yes," cried my lady. "If I were placed in a criminal dock, I could, no doubt, bring forward witnesses to refute your absurd accusation. But I am not in a criminal dock, Mr. Audley, and I do not choose to do anything but laugh at your ridiculous folly. I tell you that you are mad. If you please to say that Helen Talboys is not dead, and that I am Helen Talboys, you may do so. If you choose to go wandering about in the places in which I have lived, and to the places in which this Mrs. Talboys has lived, you must follow the bent of your own inclination. But I would warn you that such fancies have sometimes conducted people, as apparently sane as yourself, to the lifelong imprisonment of a private lunatic asylum." Robert Audley started and recoiled a few paces among the weeds and brushwood as my lady said this. "She would be capable of any new crime to shield her from the consequences of the old one," he thought. "She would be capable of using her influence with my uncle to place me in a madhouse." I do not say that Robert Audley was a coward, but I will admit that a shiver of horror, something akin to fear, chilled him to the heart as he remembered the horrible things that have been done by women since that day upon which Eve was created to be Adam's companion and helpmeet in the Garden of Eden. What if this woman's hellish power of dissimulation should be stronger than the truth, and crush him? She had not spared George Talboys when he stood in her way, and menaced her with a certain peril. Would she spare him who threatened her with a far greater danger? Are women merciful, or loving, or kind in proportion to their beauty and grace? Was there not a certain Monsieur Mazère de Latude, who had the bad fortune to offend the all-accomplished Madame de Pompadour, who expiated his youthful indiscretion by a lifelong imprisonment, who twice escaped from prison, to be twice cast back into captivity, who, trusting in the tardy generosity of his beautiful foe, betrayed himself to an implacable fiend? Robert Audley looked at the pale face of the woman standing by his side, that fair and beautiful face, illumined by starry blue eyes, that had a strange and surely a dangerous light in them, and remembered 100 stories of womanly perfidy, shuddered as he thought how unequal the struggle might be between himself and his uncle's wife. "I have shown her my cards," he thought, "but she has kept hers hidden from me. The mask that she wears is not to be plucked away. My uncle would rather think me mad than believe her guilty." The pale face of Clara Talboys, that grave and earnest face, so different in its character to my lady's fragile beauty, arose before him. "What a coward I am to think of myself or my own danger," he thought. "The more I see of this woman, the more reason I have to dread her influence upon others, the more reason to wish her far away from this house." He looked about him in the dusky obscurity. The lonely garden was as quiet as some solitary graveyard, walled in and hidden away from the world of the living. "It was somewhere in this garden that she met George Talboys upon the day of his disappearance," he thought. "I wonder where it was they met. I wonder where it was that he looked into her cruel face, and taxed her with her falsehood." My lady, with her little hand resting lightly upon the opposite post to that against which Robert leaned, toyed with her pretty foot among the long weeds, but kept a furtive watch upon her enemy's face.
"It is to be a duel to the death, then, my lady," said Robert Audley, solemnly. "You refuse to accept my warning. You refuse to run away and repent of your wickedness in some foreign place, far from the generous gentleman you have deceived and fooled by your false witcheries. You choose to remain here and defy me."
"I do," answered Lady Audley, lifting her head and looking full at the young barrister. "It is no fault of mine if my husband's nephew goes mad, and chooses me for the victim of his monomania."
"So be it, then, my lady," answered Robert. "My friend George Talboys was last seen entering these gardens by the little iron gate by which we came in tonight. He was last heard inquiring for you. He was seen to enter these gardens, but he was never seen to leave them. I believe that he met his death within the boundary of these grounds, and that his body lies hidden below some quiet water, or in some forgotten corner of this place. I will have such a search made as shall level that house to the earth, and root up every tree in these gardens, rather than I will fail in finding the grave of my murdered friend."
Lady Audley uttered a long, low, wailing cry, and threw up her arms above her head with a wild gesture of despair, but she made no answer to the ghastly charge of her accuser. Her arms dropped slowly, and she stood staring at Robert Audley, her white face gleaming through the dusk, her blue eyes glittering and dilated. "You shall never live to do this," she said. "I will kill you first. Why have you tormented me so? Why could you not let me alone? What harm had I ever done you that you should make yourself my persecutor, and dog my steps, and watch my looks, and play the spy upon me? Do you want to drive me mad? Do you know what it is to wrestle with a mad woman? No," cried my lady with a laugh, "you do not, or you would never—" She stopped abruptly, and drew herself suddenly to her fullest height. It was the same action which Robert had seen in the old half-drunken lieutenant, and it had that same dignity, the sublimity of extreme misery. "Go away, Mr. Audley," she said. "You are mad. I tell you, you are mad."
"I am going, my lady," answered Robert, quietly. "I would have condoned your crimes out of pity to your wretchedness. You have refused to accept my mercy. I wished to have pity upon the living. I shall henceforth only remember my duty to the dead."
He walked away from the lonely well under the shadow of the limes. My lady followed him slowly down that long gloomy avenue, and across the rustic bridge to the iron gate. As he passed through the gate, Alicia came out of a little half-glass door that opened from an oak-paneled breakfast-room at one angle of the house, and met her cousin upon the threshold of the gateway. "I have been looking for you everywhere, Robert," she said. "Papa has come down to the library, and he will be glad to see you." The young man started at the sound of his cousin's fresh young voice.
"Good Heaven!" he thought. "Can these two women be of the same clay? Can this frank, generous-hearted girl, who cannot conceal any impulse of her innocent nature, be of the same flesh and blood as that wretched creature whose shadow falls upon the path beside me?"
He looked from his cousin to Lady Audley, who stood near the gateway, waiting for him to stand aside and let her pass him. "I don't know what has come to your cousin, my dear Alicia," said my lady. "He is so absent-minded and eccentric as to be quite beyond my comprehension." "Indeed!" exclaimed Miss Audley. "And yet I should imagine, from the length of your tete-a-tete, that you had made some effort to understand him."
"Oh, yes," said Robert, quietly. "My lady and I understand each other very well. But as it is growing late I will wish you good evening, ladies. I shall sleep to-night at Mount Stanning, as I have some business to attend to up there, and I will come down and see my uncle to-morrow."
"What, Robert?" cried Alicia. "You surely won't go away without seeing papa?"
"Yes, my dear," answered the young man. "I am a little disturbed by some disagreeable business in which I am very much concerned, and I would rather not see my uncle. Good night, Alicia. I will come or write to-morrow."
He pressed his cousin's hand, bowed to Lady Audley, and walked away under the black shadows of the archway, and out into the quiet avenue beyond the court. My lady and Alicia stood watching him until he was out of sight. "What in goodness' name is the matter with my cousin Robert?" exclaimed Miss Audley, impatiently, as the barrister disappeared. "What does he mean by these absurd goings-on? Some disagreeable business that disturbs him, indeed. I suppose the unhappy creature has had a brief forced upon him by some evil-starred attorney, and is sinking into a state of imbecility from a dim consciousness of his own incompetence." "Have you ever studied your cousin's character, Alicia?" asked my lady very seriously after a pause. "Studied his character? No, Lady Audley, why should I study his character?" said Alicia. "There is very little study required to convince anybody that he is a lazy, selfish sybarite, who cares for nothing in the world except his own ease and comfort." "But you have never thought him eccentric?" "Eccentric?" repeated Alicia, pursing up her red lips and shrugging up her shoulders. "Well, yes. I believe that is the excuse generally made for such people. I suppose Bob is eccentric." "I have never heard you speak of his father and mother," said my lady thoughtfully. "Do you remember them?" "I never saw his mother. She was a Miss Dalrymple, a very dashing girl, who ran away with my uncle, and lost a very handsome fortune in consequence. She died at Nice when poor Bob was 5 years old." "Did you ever hear anything particular about her?" "How do you mean particular?" asked Alicia. "Did you ever hear that she was eccentric, what people call odd?" "Oh, no," said Alicia, laughing. "My aunt was a very reasonable woman, I believe, though she did marry for love. But you must remember that she died before I was born, and I have not therefore felt very much curiosity about her." "But you recollect your uncle, I suppose?" "My uncle Robert?" said Alicia. "Oh, yes, I remember him very well indeed." "Was he eccentric? I mean to say, peculiar in his habits, like your cousin?" "Yes, I believe Robert inherits all his absurdities from his father. My uncle expressed the same indifference for his fellow creatures as my cousin, but as he was a good husband, an affectionate father, and a kind master, nobody ever challenged his opinions." "But he was eccentric?" "Yes, I suppose he was generally thought a little eccentric." "Ah," said my lady gravely, "I thought as much. Do you know, Alicia, madness is more often transmitted from father to daughter, and from mother to daughter than from mother to son. Your cousin, Robert Audley, is a very handsome young man, and I believe a very good-hearted young man, but he must be watched, Alicia, for he is mad." "Mad!" cried Miss Audley, indignantly. "You are dreaming, my lady, or you are trying to frighten me," added the young lady with considerable alarm. "I only wish to put you on your guard, Alicia," answered my lady. "Mr. Audley may be, as you say, merely eccentric, but he has talked to me this evening in a manner that has filled me with absolute terror, and I believe that he is going mad. I shall speak very seriously to Sir Michael this very night." "Speak to papa!" exclaimed Alicia. "You surely won't distress papa by suggesting such a possibility." "I shall only put him on his guard, my dear Alicia." "But he'll never believe you," said Miss Audley. "He will laugh at such an idea." "No, Alicia, he will believe anything that I tell him," answered my lady, with a quiet smile. Chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Lady Audley's Secret. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Lady Audley's Secret, by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 30. Preparing the Ground. Lady Audley went from the garden to the library, a pleasant, oak-paneled, homely apartment, in which Sir Michael liked to sit reading or writing, or arranging the business of his estate with his steward, a stalwart countryman, half agriculturalist, half lawyer, who rented a small farm a few miles from the Court. The baronet was seated in a capacious easy-chair near the hearth. The bright blaze of the fire rose and fell, flashing now upon the polished carvings of the black oak bookcase, now upon the gold and scarlet bindings of the books, sometimes glimmering upon the Athenian helmet of a marble palace, sometimes lighting up the forehead of Sir Robert Peel. The lamp upon the reading-table had not yet been lighted, and Sir Michael sat in the firelight, waiting for the coming of his young wife. It is impossible for me ever to tell the purity of his generous love. It is impossible to describe that affection which was as tender as the love of a young mother for her firstborn, as brave and chivalrous as the heroic passion of a Bayard for his liege mistress. The door opened while he was thinking of this fondly loved wife, and looking up, The baronet saw the slender form standing in the doorway.
"Why, my darling!" he exclaimed, as my lady closed the door behind her and came toward his chair. "I have been thinking of you and waiting for you an hour. Where have you been, and what have you been doing?"
My lady, standing in the shadow rather than the light, paused a few moments before replying to this question. "I have been to Chelmsford," she said, "shopping, and—" She hesitated, twisting her bonnet strings in her thin white fingers with an air of pretty embarrassment.
"And what, my dear?" asked the baronet. "What have you been doing since you came from Chelmsford? I heard a carriage stop at the door an hour ago. It was yours, was it not?"
"Yes, I came home an hour ago," answered my lady with the same air of embarrassment.
"And what have you been doing since you came home?"
Sir Michael Audley asked this question with a slightly reproachful accent. His young wife's presence made the sunshine of his life, and though he could not bear to chain her to his side, it grieved him to think that she could willingly remain unnecessarily absent from him, frittering away her time in some childish talk or frivolous occupation.
"What have you been doing since you came home, my dear?" he repeated. "What has kept you so long away from me?"
"I have been talking to Mr. Robert Audley." She still twisted her bonnet string round and round her fingers. She still spoke with the same air of embarrassment.
"Robert!" exclaimed the baronet. "Is Robert here?"
"He was here a little while ago."
"And is here still, I suppose?"
"No, he has gone away."
"Gone away?" cried Sir Michael. "What do you mean, my darling?"
"I mean that your nephew came to the Court this afternoon. Alicia and I found him idling about the gardens. He stayed here till about a quarter of an hour ago talking to me, and then he hurried off without a word of explanation, except, indeed, some ridiculous excuse about business at Mount Stanning."
"Business at Mount Stanning? Why, what business can he possibly have in that out-of-the-way place? He has gone to sleep at Mount Stanning, then, I suppose?"
"Yes, I think he said something to that effect."
"Upon my word," exclaimed the baronet, "I think that boy is half mad."
My lady's face was so much in shadow that Sir Michael Audley was unaware of the bright change that came over its sickly pallor as he made this very commonplace observation. A triumphant smile illuminated Lucy Audley's countenance, a smile that plainly said, "It is coming, it is coming. I can twist him which way I like. I can put black before him, and if I say it is white, he will believe me." But Sir Michael Audley, in declaring that his nephew's wits were disordered, merely uttered that commonplace ejaculation which is well known to have very little meaning. The baronet had, it is true, no very great estimate of Robert's faculty for the business of this everyday life. He was in the habit of looking upon his nephew as a good-natured nonentity, a man whose heart had been amply stocked by liberal nature with all the best things the generous goddess had to bestow, but whose brain had been somewhat overlooked in the distribution of intellectual gifts. Sir Michael Audley made that mistake which is very commonly made by easy-going, well-to-do observers who have no occasion to look below the surface. He mistook laziness for incapacity. He thought because his nephew was idle, he must necessarily be stupid. He concluded that if Robert did not distinguish himself, it was because he could not. He forgot the mute, inglorious Miltons, who die voiceless and inarticulate for want of that dogged perseverance, that blind courage, which the poet must possess before he can find a publisher. He forgot the Cromwells, who see the noble vessels of the state floundering upon a sea of confusion, and going down in a tempest of noisy bewilderment, and who are yet powerless to get at the helm, forbidden even to send out a lifeboat to the sinking ship. Surely it is a mistake to judge of what a man can do by that which he has done. The world's Valhalla is a close borough, and perhaps the greatest men may be those who perish silently far away from the sacred portal. Perhaps the purest and brightest spirits are those who shrink from the turmoil of the race-course, the tumult and confusion of the struggle. The game of life is something like the game of écarté, and it may be that the very best cards are sometimes left in the pack. My lady threw off her bonnet, and seated herself upon a velvet-covered footstool at Sir Michael's feet. There was nothing studied or affected in this girlish action. It was so natural to Lucy Audley to be childish that no one would have wished to see her otherwise. It would have seemed as foolish to expect dignified reserve or womanly gravity from this amber-haired siren, as to wish for rich basses amid the clear treble of a skylark's song. She sat with her pale face turned away from the firelight, and with her hands locked together upon the arm of her husband's easy-chair. They were very restless, these slender white hands. My lady twisted the jeweled fingers in and out of each other as she talked to her husband. "I wanted to come to you, you know, dear," said she. "I wanted to come to you directly I got home, but Mr. Audley insisted upon my stopping to talk to him."
"But what about, my love?" asked the baronet. "What could Robert have to say to you?"
My lady did not answer this question. Her fair head dropped upon her husband's knee, her rippling yellow curls fell over her face. Sir Michael lifted that beautiful head with his strong hands, and raised my lady's face. The firelight shining on that pale face lit up the large, soft blue eyes, and showed them drowned in tears.
"Lucy, Lucy!" cried the baronet. "What is the meaning of this? My love, what has happened to distress you in this manner?"
Lady Audley tried to speak, but the words died inarticulately upon her trembling lips. A choking sensation in her throat seemed to strangle those false and plausible words, her only armor against her enemies. She could not speak. The agony she had endured silently in the dismal lime-walk had grown too strong for her, and she broke into a tempest of hysterical sobbing. It was no simulated grief that shook her slender frame and tore at her like some ravenous beast that would have rent her piecemeal with its horrible strength. It was a storm of real anguish and terror, of remorse and misery. It was the one wild outcry in which the woman's feebler nature got the better of the siren's art. It was not thus that she had meant to fight her terrible duel with Robert Audley. Those were not the weapons which she had intended to use, but perhaps no artifice which she could have devised would have served her so well as this one outburst of natural grief. It shook her husband to the very soul. It bewildered and terrified him. It reduced the strong intellect of the man to helpless confusion and perplexity. It struck at the one weak point in a good man's nature. It appealed straight to Sir Michael Audley's affection for his wife. Ah, heaven help a strong man's tender weakness for the woman he loves. Heaven pity him when the guilty creature has deceived him, and comes with her tears and lamentations to throw herself at his feet in self-abandonment and remorse, torturing him with the sight of her agony, rending his heart with her sobs, lacerating his breast with her groans, multiplying her sufferings into a great anguish for him to bear, multiplying them by 20-fold, multiplying them in a ratio of a brave man's capacity for endurance. Heaven forgive him, if maddened by that cruel agony, the balance wavers for a moment, and he is ready to forgive anything, ready to take this wretched one to the shelter of his breast, and to pardon that which the stern voice of manly honor urges must not be pardoned. Pity him, pity him. The wife's worst remorse when she stands without the threshold of the home she may never enter more is not equal to the agony of the husband who closes the portal on that familiar and entreating face. The anguish of the mother who may never look again upon her children is less than the torment of the father who has to say to those little ones, "My darlings, you are henceforth motherless." Sir Michael Audley rose from his chair, trembling with indignation, and ready to do immediate battle with the person who had caused his wife's grief. "Lucy," he said, "Lucy, I insist upon your telling me what and who has distressed you. I insist upon it. Whoever has annoyed you shall answer to me for your grief. Come, my love, tell me directly what it is." He seated himself and bent over the drooping figure at his feet, calming his own agitation in his desire to soothe his wife's distress. "Tell me what it is, my dear," he whispered tenderly. The sharp paroxysm had passed away, and my lady looked up. A glittering light shone through the tears in her eyes, and the lines about her pretty rosy mouth, those hard and cruel lines which Robert Audley had observed in the pre-Raphaelite portrait, were plainly visible in the firelight. "I am very silly," she said, "but really he has made me quite hysterical." "Who has made you hysterical?" "Your nephew, Mr. Robert Audley." "Robert!" cried the baronet. "Lucy, what do you mean?" "I told you that Mr. Audley insisted upon my going into the lime-walk, dear," said my lady. "He wanted to talk to me, he said, and I went, and he said such horrible things that—" "What horrible things, Lucy?" Lady Audley shuddered, and clung with convulsive fingers to the strong hand that had rested caressingly upon her shoulder. "What did he say, Lucy?" "Oh, my dear love, how can I tell you?" cried my lady. "I know that I shall distress you, or you will laugh at me, and then"
"Laugh at you? No, Lucy."
Lady Audley was silent for a moment. She sat looking straight before her into the fire, with her fingers still locked about her husband's hand. "My dear," she said slowly, hesitating now and then between her words, as if she almost shrunk from uttering them. "Have you ever—I am so afraid of vexing you—have you ever thought Mr. Audley a little—a little—"
"A little what, my darling?"
"a little out of his mind?" faltered Lady Audley.
"Out of his mind!" cried Sir Michael. "My dear girl, what are you thinking of?"
"You said just now, dear, that you thought he was half mad."
"Did I, my love?" said the baronet, laughing. "I don't remember saying it, and it was a mere façon de parler, that meant nothing whatever. Robert may be a little eccentric, a little stupid, perhaps. He mayn't be overburdened with wits, but I don't think he has brains enough for madness. I believe it's generally your great intellects that get out of order."
"But madness is sometimes hereditary," said my lady. "Mr. Audley may have inherited—"
"He has inherited no madness from his father's family," interrupted Sir Michael. "The Audleys have never peopled private lunatic asylums, or feed mad doctors."
"Nor from his mother's family?"
"Not to my knowledge."
"People generally keep these things a secret," said my lady gravely. "There may have been madness in your sister-in-law's family."
"I don't think so, my dear," replied Sir Michael. "But, Lucy, tell me what, in heaven's name, has put this idea into your head?"
"I have been trying to account for your nephew's conduct. I can account for it in no other manner. If you had heard the things he said to me to-night, Sir Michael, you too might have thought him mad."
"But what did he say, Lucy?"
"I can scarcely tell you. You can see how much he has stupefied and bewildered me. I believe he has lived too long alone in those solitary Temple chambers. Perhaps he reads too much, or smokes too much. You know that some physicians declare madness to be a mere illness of the brain, an illness to which any one is subject, and which may be produced by given causes, and cured by given means." Lady Audley's eyes were still fixed upon the burning coals in the wide grate. She spoke as if she had been discussing a subject that she had often heard discussed before. She spoke as if her mind had almost wandered away from the thought of her husband's nephew to the wider question of madness in the abstract. "Why should he not be mad?" resumed my lady. "People are insane for years and years before their insanity is found out. They know that they are mad, but they know how to keep their secret, and perhaps they may sometimes keep it till they die. Sometimes a paroxysm seizes them, and in an evil hour they betray themselves. They commit a crime, perhaps. The horrible temptation of opportunity assails them. The knife is in their hand, and the unconscious victim by their side. They may conquer the restless demon and go away and die innocent of any violent deed, but they may yield to the horrible temptation, the frightful, passionate, hungry craving for violence and horror. They sometimes yield and are lost." Lady Audley's voice rose as she argued this dreadful question. The hysterical excitement from which she had only just recovered had left its effects upon her, but she controlled herself, and her tone grew calmer as she resumed. "Robert Audley is mad," she said decisively. "What is one of the strangest diagnostics of madness? What is the first appalling sign of mental aberration? The mind becomes stationary, the brain stagnates, the even current of reflection is interrupted, the thinking power of the brain resolves itself into a monotone. As the waters of a tideless pool putrefy by reason of their stagnation, the mind becomes turbid and corrupt through lack of action, and the perpetual reflection upon one subject resolves itself into monomania. Robert Audley is a monomaniac. The disappearance of his friend, George Talboys, grieved and bewildered him. He dwelt upon this one idea until he lost the power of thinking of anything else. The one idea looked at perpetually became distorted to his mental vision. Repeat the commonest word in the English language 20 times, and before the 20th repetition you will have begun to wonder whether the word which you repeat is really the word you mean to utter. Robert Audley has thought of his friend's disappearance until the one idea has done its fatal and unhealthy work. He looks at a common event with a vision that is diseased, and he distorts it into a gloomy horror engendered of his own monomania. If you do not want to make me as mad as he is, you must never let me see him again. He declared tonight that George Talboys was murdered in this place, and that he will root up every tree in the garden, and pull down every brick in the house, and search for—" My lady paused. The words died away upon her lips. She had exhausted herself by the strange energy with which she had spoken. She had been transformed from a frivolous, childish beauty into a woman, strong to argue her own cause, and plead her own defense. "Pull down this house!" cried the baronet. "George Talboys murdered at Audley Court! Did Robert say this, Lucy?" "He said something of that kind, something that frightened me very much." "Then he must be mad," said Sir Michael gravely. "I'm bewildered by what you tell me. Did he really say this, Lucy, or did you misunderstand him?" I don't think I did," faltered my lady. "You saw how frightened I was when I first came in. I should not have been so much agitated if he hadn't said something horrible." Lady Audley had availed herself of the very strongest arguments by which she could help her cause. "To be sure, my darling, to be sure," answered the baronet. "What could have put such a horrible fancy into the unhappy boy's head? This Mr. Talboys, a perfect stranger to all of us, murdered at Audley Court! I'll go to Mount Stanning tonight and see Robert. I have known him ever since he was a baby, and I cannot be deceived in him. If there is really anything wrong, he will not be able to conceal it from me." My lady shrugged her shoulders. "That is rather an open question," she said. "It is generally a stranger who is the first to observe any psychological peculiarity." The big words sounded strange from my lady's rosy lips, but her newly adopted wisdom had a certain quaint prettiness about it, which charmed and bewildered her husband. "But you must not go to Mount Stanning, my dear darling," she said tenderly. "Remember that you are under strict orders to stay indoors until the weather is milder, and the sun shines upon this cruel, ice-bound country." Sir Michael Audley sank back in his capacious chair with a sigh of resignation. "That's true, Lucy," he said. "We must obey Mr. Dawson. I suppose Robert will come to see me tomorrow." "Yes, dear. I think he said he would." "Then we must wait till tomorrow, my darling. I can't believe that there is anything really wrong with the poor boy. I can't believe it, Lucy." "Then how do you account for this extraordinary delusion about this Mr. Talboys?" asked my lady. Sir Michael shook his head. "I don't know, Lucy, I don't know," he answered. "It is always so difficult to believe that any one of the calamities that continually befall our fellow men will ever happen to us. I can't believe that my nephew's mind is impaired. I can't believe it. I'll get him to stop here, Lucy, and I'll watch him closely. I tell you, my love, if there is anything wrong, I am sure to find it out. I can't be mistaken in a young man who has always been the same to me as my own son. But, my darling, why were you so frightened by Robert's wild talk? It could not affect you." My lady sighed piteously. "You must think me very strong-minded, Sir Michael," she said, with rather an injured air, "if you imagine I can hear of these sorts of things indifferently. I know I shall never be able to see Mr. Audley again." "And you shall not, my dear, you shall not." "You said just now you would have him here," murmured Lady Audley. "But I will not, my darling girl, if his presence annoys you. Good heaven! Lucy, can you imagine for a moment that I have any higher wish than to promote your happiness? I will consult some London physician about Robert, and let him discover if there is really anything the matter with my poor brother's only son. You shall not be annoyed, Lucy." "You must think me very unkind, dear," said my lady, "and I know I ought not to be annoyed by the poor fellow, but he really seems to have taken some absurd notion into his head about me."
"About you, Lucy?" cried Sir Michael.
"Yes, dear. He seems to connect me in some vague manner, which I cannot quite understand, with the disappearance of this Mr. Talboys."
"Impossible, Lucy. You must have misunderstood him."
"I don't think so."
"Then he must be mad," said the baronet. "He must be mad. I will wait till he goes back to town, and then send someone to his chambers to talk to him. Good heaven, what a mysterious business this is!"
"I fear I have distressed you, darling," murmured Lady Audley.
"Yes, my dear, I am very much distressed by what you have told me, but you were quite right to talk to me frankly about this dreadful business. I must think it over, dearest, and try and decide what is best to be done."
My lady rose from the low ottoman on which she had been seated. The fire had burned down, and there was only a faint glow of red light in the room. Lucy Audley bent over her husband's chair, and put her lips to his broad forehead. "How good you have always been to me, dear," she whispered softly. "You would never let any one influence you against me, would you, dear?"
"Influence me against you?" repeated the baronet. "No, my love."
"Because you know, dear," pursued my lady, "there are wicked people as well as mad people in the world, and there may be some persons to whose interest it would be to injure me."
"They had better not try it, then, my dear," answered Sir Michael. "They would find themselves in rather a dangerous position if they did."
Lady Audley laughed aloud, with a gay, triumphant, silvery peal of laughter that vibrated through the quiet room. "My own dear darling," she said, "I know you love me. And now I must run away, dear, for it's past 7 o'clock. I was engaged to dine at Mrs. Montford's, but I must send a groom with a message of apology, for Mr. Audley has made me quite unfit for company. I shall stay at home and nurse you, dear. You'll go to bed very early, won't you, and take great care of yourself?"
"Yes, dear."
My lady tripped out of the room to give her orders about the message that was to be carried to the house at which she was to have dined. She paused for a moment as she closed the library door. She paused, and laid her hand upon her breast to check the rapid throbbing of her heart. "I have been afraid of you, Mr. Robert Audley," she thought, "but perhaps the time may come in which you will have cause to be afraid of me." Chapter 30